The two gathering music videos were the first, Taking Back the Power, a woman's right anthem and music video with 6 young recording artists. The music was inspired by women's marches, the Me Too movement, and the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. The second video was a live performance of Maya Angelou reading her poem, And I Rise. And I just love that one. It makes me smile, brings just life. And yet both of these videos celebrate women in different ways, our challenges, sexuality, power, and successes. Welcome to all. I'm Rachel Daniels. I'm your worship associate, and thank you all for turning your clocks ahead and making it here with us. In Unitarian Universalism, we care about you, accept you for who and what you are. We recognize that each of us, in our own unique way, are on our spiritual journey, and yet we come together. No matter who you love, your age, the color of your skin, your immigration or economic status, you are loved for who you are. This is a safe space to stand out, stand up, and change your mind. Our main doctrine is love. Each Sunday is a community effort. I should say each Sunday service is a community effort. For the sound and PowerPoint and other AV magic, we thank Pam and Don. Beautiful live music comes from Carol, our music director. Posting the hymn words is done by Dara. Lit candles, hot coffee, delicious cookies, maintained sanctuary are brought to you by Paul and Candy. Scheduling of speakers and masterfully juggling the availability of the speakers is done by Kendra. Cindy Williams posts on Facebook. Kendra posts on other social media. The board and worship committee and all of you keep this fellowship together. So thank you for joining us today. And now we have a slide that's coming up that shows our upcoming services. We have Dr. Glenna Matthews today, and we're so lucky to have her, historian, author, close friend of the UUFLB. Next week, we have Chaplain John Bloom Ramirez. And then we'll also have a special collection next week to assist the Ukrainians. The collection will go to, I think, UUSC, our service committee, and they're going to gather and put our funds together with other congregations to make the most impact to ease the suffering of the Ukrainians. So please get ready, and on your checks, you'll want to put in a little memo section that it does go to the UUSC and or just write Ukraine. And then as you can see from the slide, at the end of the month for our social justice service, we'll have the South Coast Water District. And then I have a couple of services in April showing Emmeline will be back with us, as well as a spiritual and sound healing experience, which amazingly is beautiful here in person and also works on Zoom, but it's quite phenomenal to have Stacy with us. So please plan on joining us for all these services. And then, as we all know, March is Women's History Month, and there's no one better to help us celebrate it than Dr. Glenna Matthews. She's going to bring alive 4 of the extraordinary Unitarian or Universalist women who have left an undeniable impact on U.S. history. Glenna is a longtime friend of our fellowship. Glenna was part of our UUFLB worship committee way back when. And let's see, Glenna committed, or I should say, Dr. Matthews completed her Ph.D. at Stanford University, has been a visiting associate professor of history at UC Berkeley, at Stanford University, at UCLA, UCI, and UC Davis. Glenna has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities for her significant contributions, as well as being a Fulbright scholar in Russia. Glenna is the author of 5 books about American women's history, as well as being the author of numerous published articles. Glenna is sought out as a lecturer and continues to lecture on history locally, nationally, and globally. I recently read one of Glenna's books that I had had up on my shelf for a while. And I mean, I didn't pull it down because it's a history book and not a murder mystery. But I was surprised and fascinated and kept reading the book. Glenna wrote about women's contributions, and it allowed me to recognize how pertinent these women are to shaping today's events. And the women themselves became like almost friends of mine. The book I read was The Rise of Public Woman, Woman's Power and Woman's Place in the United States from 1630 to 1970. And it was, well, I think it's a really important book, well-researched and just beautifully written. And now I look forward to reading, the other 4 of the books that Glenna's written. We continue to fight for gender equality, equal pay. We fight against sexual assault, sexual abuse, and so much more. And the change is slow. Like racial justice, gender roles only inch forward towards equality. But in looking back, we've made some real strides. Way back when, some 40 years ago, I was the first woman hired in my office to be an agricultural inspector. The other male inspectors said women couldn't do the job, and they used to bang their coffee cups on our Friday staff meetings. Goddamn affirmative action women. And yet we were able to do the job. After I was hired, it opened the door for more women. And then in our offices statewide, they began hiring women. And, of course, women could do the job. Come on. And the 4 women Glenna will be telling us about later in today's service, they really almost bulldozed the closed doors around gender roles and shifted the world forward to more equality. And they were UUs, part of our Unitarian Universalist history. So stay tuned, and a recording of today's service will be posted later in the week. And then for those on Zoom, you received the order of service in your email. And if you're here in the fellowship, there's a copy in the back of the room. And if anyone cares to light a candle during the service for joys and sorrows, feel free. Our candles are set up over there. And then we'll have spoken joys and sorrows for those on Zoom later in the service. And Glenna has agreed to stick around shortly, not for too long after the service, to answer questions. And I have my wonderful husband who has agreed to light the chalice today as I read the chalice lighting words. Everywhere on Sunday mornings, Unitarians light the chalice. If you have a candle at home, you can light it now. And our chalice lighting words are, as we light this chalice, come into the circle of community. Come into this sacred space. Bring your whole self, bring the joy that makes your heart sing, bring your kindness, bring your compassion. Bring also your sorrow, your pain, your brokenness and disappointments. Together, in the wholeness of community, whether in person or by Zoom, we share the joy of being us and the flame of togetherness. Thank you, Brian. You did a very good job. I've selected 4 centering thoughts for today. And they're about strong women. And I thought of them because of the paths that continue to be opened to us because of many of the strong women that have come before us. So we're going to read the centering thoughts together. Here in the fellowship, please read along. The centering thoughts will be on the screen. And on Zoom, please unmute yourselves and we'll read together. Centering thought number 1. Okay, together. I am not
afraid of storms,
because I am
learning
how
how
to
to
sail
sail
my
my
ship.
ship.
Louisa May Alcott.
Hmm.
The next one. Whatever
Whatever
women
women
do, they
do,
must do
they must do twice as
Twice as well
well
as men
to be thought
half as good.
Luckily,
Especially
especially in
in
politics,
politics,
this is not difficult. Very good.
Centering thought number 3.
Don't worry
Don't worry
about
about
messing up
or
or
failing. Only
Only
those
those
who do
who
nothing
Never
never
make
make
mistakes.
mistakes.
Dr. Reva Morton Diamond. My mom.
Ah,
And the last one.
The beauty of
Beauty of
being
being
a
a feminist
feminist
is that you
is
get
that you
to
get
be
to
whatever
be
you want.
whatever you want.
and that's
And
the
that's
point.
the point. Shonda
Shonda
Rhimes.
Rhimes,
Hmm.
TV producer, writer, actress, so much more. Now we'll have our opening hymn. We'll turn to our music director, Carol Cole, This Little Light of Mine. And it's in your gray hymnal. Grab a book in the back of the room. Please feel free to sing along. 118.
Good morning, everyone. Please join along with me on This Little Light of Mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Building up the world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up the world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up the world, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Thank you, Carol. Now we're going to have our Unison Affirmation. You'll once again unmute yourselves and we'll read it together. And here in the fellowship, the words will be on the screen. Love
Love is the spirit of this fellowship,
and
and
service.
service is law.
This
This is our great covenant.
Covenant.
well together.
Dwell
Dwell
together
together in
in
peace,
to
to
seek
to
the
seek
truth
truth
in
in
love,
love,
and to
to
help
help
one
help
another.
one another.
Now we pause the recording for our joys and sorrows. We're going to start with the people on Zoom. One of the ways is by your financial support. Carol will be playing while we pass the basket. I say we, but Candy, thank you for passing the basket. And we'll have a slide. Well, you see the slide up that shows how you can donate. It's also in the email notice that went out to you. And remember, if you're mailing in checks, if you're mailing them in and you want part of the funds to go to Ukraine, make that in the memo. And also if there's a place, if you donate online and you want it to go to assist and to ease the suffering for the Ukrainians, also make that a note so we get it directed to the correct place. Please stand as you feel comfortable here in the sanctuary as we sing to each other while masked. And those on Zoom, please sing along. From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live.
From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live. From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live.
Thank you, everyone. Now's the time for meditation, contemplation, and or prayer, whatever you feel comfortable with. Just going to take a moment to be quiet, breathe in, breathe out. Maybe think of a hug or a person or a situation that brought you a little joy, and then or something that gives you a smile. And then take that smile and start at your toes and your feet and just run that smile through your body as you breathe in and breathe out. And then take that smile and send it out into the world. So much strife going on. Let's just hope that what we do here and in our lives, that every day we help to ease people's pain. So please take a moment, take a smile, breathe in and breathe out. And Carol will bring us out of our moment of meditation or prayer. And now our fabulous speaker, Dr. Glenna Matthews, on our UU ForeMothers.
Well, it's a delight to be here and to speak about some of my absolutely favorite women in the world. As Rachel said, they have become friends, and they're not the only friends who have been long dead, if you're a historian. These women all lived in the 19th century, and they were all born within the same 15-year period between 1810 and 1825. And I want to suggest at the outset, before we talk about each of the individual women, that this was not a coincidence, that some of the great women in American history were Unitarians or Universalists, because in breaking with Calvinism, the two denominations, which are now one, there was this tremendous release of creativity and energy and openness. And I want to highlight a meeting. I'm sure all of us have heard of William Ellery Channing, sometimes called the Unitarian Pope. It was his speech in 1819 on Unitarian Christianity that's often seen as kind of like the opening salvo in the forming of our denomination in of Unitarians in the 19th century. So here's Channing, who became very celebrated. I mean, when Dickens, for example, came to the US, he was eager to meet Channing. And as a relatively young clergyman, he was influential in so many ways. He's in the Boston area, and there's another young person, much younger, Elizabeth Peabody, one of the famous Peabody sisters of Salem. And I got this in a book about the Peabody sisters, that Elizabeth was this brilliant young woman, and the great William Ellery Channing was willing to sit down with a 20-year-old, and they talked about the influence of German Romanticism. They talked about ideas that would be the foundation for Transcendentalism. And so, I mean, I think it's so remarkable that a famous clergyman would sit down with a young girl and have in-depth conversation. And I think it's indicative. I love this story because it's indicative of the way in which the erosion of Calvinism was opening up new possibilities. And that leads me directly to talk about the first of our great women that we're going to be focusing on, and that's Margaret Fuller, who was born in 1810. And the same woman, actually, who wrote about the Peabody sisters, wrote this wonderful book about Margaret Fuller, won the Pulitzer Prize. Her name is Megan Marshall. So Margaret Fuller is born in Massachusetts, and she was a child prodigy. She was one of, you think of Mozart and a few others, with fathers who really almost force-fed them. And maybe it was hard on the child's emotional development, but it certainly produced a number of geniuses, of which Margaret Fuller was absolutely one. She became a teacher, and she wanted to go to Harvard, as so many of her male contemporaries were. That wasn't open to her. So she founded this series of conversations in the Boston area and talked about, the same kind of things that Channing and Elizabeth Peabody were talking about. That is, the ideas that were current. Samuel Coleridge, who was very influential, Goethe, great writers on the other side of the pond, and they were very inspiring on this side of the pond. So Margaret Fuller, child prodigy, her father, Timothy Fuller, force-fed her. She became a teacher, and then somewhere along the way, in these years, she encountered Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I love this, she would go and visit the Emersons at their home in Concord. Mrs. Emerson, Lydian, would keep the household running, and the two great intellects would go off into a room and have deep conversations for maybe 2 or 3 days. So, she impressed everybody that met her. Sometimes it wasn't favorably. Sometimes people thought she was arrogant. A lot of people thought she was arrogant, but there was substance behind her assertions of her own brilliance. After the Concord period and after teaching, she moved to New York and became one of the very first women journalists. She wrote for the New York Tribune. She wrote literary criticism, which is highly regarded. She wrote exposés. She wrote an expose of a women's prison. And some of those articles she turned into a pioneering work of feminist thought called Woman in the 19th Century. And somewhere this morning it's been mentioned, I forget whose quote it was, when you're a woman, you can do anything. Well, one of the great lines from Woman in the 19th Century, Fuller says, let them be sea captains if they will. And that was her general, philosophy. So at one point, she apparently said, I forget just to whom she said this, but she said, I have now met all the people in the US worth knowing, and I find no intellect that can compare with my own. So she moved on to Europe. And she went to visit, you know, some of the famous people, Thomas Carlyle, who was a friend of Emerson's. She visited in Paris. She visited George Sand, the great French woman novelist. She got to know Mazzini, who was part of the Italian liberation movement to liberate Italy from the Austrians, and a great Polish figure, Adam Mickiewicz, part of trying to throw the Russian yoke off of Poland, which didn't happen right away, to put it mildly. So she's on an international stage at this point. And then Mazzini convinces her that the place for action is Italy. And she goes to Italy and throws herself into this, political revolutionary circles there. In 1848 was the year of revolution all over Europe. There was a revolution in France, one in abortive in Italy, just uprisings all over. And in Italy, it was to throw off the yoke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. While in Italy, she met, in this country, she intimidated all the young men of her generation. They liked talking to her, but they found her a little scary, I think is fair to say. But when she got to Italy, she met a young nobleman, Count Osoli, who apparently, he was 10 years younger than she, and apparently he was not terrified of her. And so they had developed a romance, and it's unclear whether they married or not, but they did have a child. And she was, when you read biographies of Margaret Fuller, I've read a couple of them now, she was hiding in this little, well, not exactly hiding, but she was in this peasant village while Count Osoli went off to fight the Austro-Hungarians, giving birth and corresponding with this Polish guy, Mickiewicz, who was telling her to be, to have courage. Well, the revolution ended unhappily. Count Osoli's family did not take kindly to this American intellectual in their son's life. And so the two of them and the child decided that the thing to do was to return to the US. And they were offshore of Fire Island, which is very close to New York City, when the ship went down. And that was in 1850. So she died when she was only, 1810 to 1850. Those are her dates. And Emerson sent Thoreau to see if he could find anything that washed up on shore. She had been, while in Italy, while experiencing the Italian Revolution, she sent, she's a pioneering war correspondent. She is writing dispatches back to the New York Tribune, and she had a manuscript about the Italian Revolution that went down with the ship as well. But Emerson sent Thoreau to see if any of, leaves of her manuscript might have washed up on shore, and that was not to be. And just parenthetically, I should say that I have long thought that somebody should make a movie about this woman. I don't mean a documentary, I mean a feature-length film. This is such a dramatic life. And I hate to be corny, but romance with a younger Italian nobleman, and the revolution and etc. So she's, in fact, my granddaughter, Margaret, is named for Margaret Fuller. We are big Margaret Fuller fans in our family. Oh, she was the first, she was a major intellectual of the 19th century. I never heard about her until I got to graduate school. But now, I mean, there's a whole cottage industry of studying Margaret Fuller. The next person that I'm wanting to talk about, so each of these four women is a pioneer. Margaret Fuller was the first major intellectual who happened to be a woman. The next person, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, her dates were 1825 to 1911. She was born to free Black parents in Baltimore. She had some education that ended at 13. And from then on, she taught herself. Her first publication of poetry was when she was only 20. And so if you can imagine this young woman who had, but the 19th century is the great age of these. Abraham Lincoln didn't have much formal education, neither did Frederick Douglass. So she's in this great line of brilliant, talented people whose ambition leads them to educate themselves in spite of the obstacles and to become wordsmiths of a very high order. Before too much longer, she traveled with Sojourner Truth as part of her abolitionist, I guess you'd say, training to be an abolitionist speaker. And in 1854, she would have been 29, she became the first Black woman to be a paid abolitionist agent. So that's how she was, among the many ways in which she was pioneering. Harper published in The Liberator, which was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. And she shared, she became a very practiced public speaker. She's publishing poetry. She shared a platform with, on one occasion, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So she was, shall we say, hanging out with the big guns of 19th century reform. And after the Civil War, she became active in the temperance movement and continued writing. And in 1892, she published this, which is what the writing she's best known for. Iola Leroy. I-O-L-A-L-E-R-O-Y. And it's a fascinating novel. It's set in Reconstruction. The premise is that there's a young woman of mixed race, with a white slave master father, and she's a pet. He doesn't treat her like a slave, but then when he dies, and this is, in the Reconstruction period, then she has a choice to make. Does she pass, or does she accept the yoke of a Black identity at this perilous moment in American history when Jim Crow is being formulated? And I want to say that some of you know that I am a passionate lover of Charles Dickens, and I go every year to the Dickens universe. That's before the pandemic, where we discuss a different Dickens novel. And it's been going for more than 40 years, rotate through different novels, and every 15 years or so, there's fresh insights. Well, this year, for the very first time, we're discussing David Copperfield. And guess what? Iola Leroy. And this is in response to a movement of young people of color in the field of Victorian studies who decided that the field was too white, and put pressure on the people who organized the Dickens universe. So last summer, or maybe it was in 2020, this was going to be in 2020, but it got postponed a couple of years. But in 2020, instead of this full-blown, week-long in-person at UC Santa Cruz, we had a virtual a virtual set of programs, and it focused on Iola Leroy. Well, I taught Iola Leroy. I write about this novel, but this was 20 or 30 years ago. There's now a whole field of Frances Harper studies. There are brilliant scholars who are working on her transatlantic influences, on the print culture that underlay. There's a scholar who's at Cornell who works on Black print culture and of this era. So again, just like with the hidden history of women, there's this whole, because when we think about African American history in the 19th century, we tend to think of enslavement. But there's this whole culture of Black print culture, out of which Frances Harper arose, and she was a major contributor to it. She knew Harriet Tubman, the 19th century figure, but she also knew the great Ida B. Wells, who began her activism against lynching in the 19th century, but lived on well into the 20th century to be a very important influence. So Frances Harper lives till 1911, and she just, she's a capacious figure. She will repay going down. Don recently just talked about going down a James Baldwin rabbit hole. Well, you could easily go down a Frances Harper rabbit hole and be the better for it, because this field is just so exciting. There's so much new scholarship. And she was a Unitarian. I don't know a lot about her religious life, but I know we claim her and I'm claiming her. The next figure I want to talk about is Mary Livermore. Now, Margaret Fuller was the first American intellectual to be female. Frances Harper was the first paid Black woman to be an abolitionist agent, among her many accomplishments. Mary Livermore, about whom we'll speak next, I would suggest was a pioneer in running a huge enterprise during the Civil War. But let me not get ahead of my story. She was born in 1820. She was a teacher, an abolitionist, and she married a Universalist minister named Daniel Livermore. And the two of them moved to Chicago, and she worked for him as a journalist, and she covered the Republican convention in Chicago that nominated Abraham Lincoln, for example. Not many women journalists covering a political convention in those years. Well, when the Civil War broke out, she was in Chicago and full of energy to do something. And I need to say a little bit about the Sanitary Commission. It was really a Unitarian enterprise in a lot of ways. The national chair of the Sanitary Commission was founded at the urging of women who were inspired by Florence Nightingale, women in New York. They saw that Florence Nightingale's administrations had saved lives in the Crimean War, and they didn't want their men to die unnecessarily. And so they were trying to organize to improve medical care, get more doctors. When the Civil War broke out, there were only 26 Army doctors in the Federal Army. And this is a war where hundreds of thousands of men were in arms. So anyhow, Henry Whitney Bellows, famous Unitarian clergyman in New York, becomes the head of the Sanitary Commission. And so it's, at this point, women just didn't run things. So the women had the initial idea, but the men are, shall we say, the hierarchy. But then the women were the ones that were on the ground doing the work. So Mary Livermore in Chicago with colleague, another woman, organized the Chicago branch of the Sanitary Commission, and they encouraged donations. At one point, I came across the fact that they sent 78,000 packages of medical supplies or hospital gowns for wounded soldiers, just from that one office. So when I say she became a pioneer as a woman, and this is a huge undertaking that she runs, the Sanitary Commission office. And then she was concerned that that wasn't enough, so she pioneered in having sanitary fairs as fundraisers. And they needed to engage a hall to hold the sanitary fair. So here they've been doing all this organizing and, organizing women in small towns all through the upper Midwest to sew for the soldiers and so on. But when they went to hire the hall, they found out that as married women, they couldn't sign the contract. So that was one of those aha moments for her. And she vowed to devote herself after the war ended to feminism, which she did, although it wasn't called feminism then. Well, her actions were so meaningful that after the war ended, Henry Bellows wrote to Mary Livermore, "The women have constituted themselves as a great national quilting party. The state so many patches, each of its own color or stuff. The boundaries of the nation, the frame of the work, and at it they have gone with needles and busy fingers and their very heartstrings for thread, and sewed away, adding square to square and row to row, allowing no piece or part to escape their plan of union. And the territorial area of the loyal states is all of a piece, first tacked and basted, then sewed and stitched by women's hands, wet often with women's tears and woven in with women's prayers. And now at length you might truly say the national quilt, all striped and starred, will tear anywhere sooner than in the seams which they have joined in a blessed and inseparable unity." I just love this quotation. So she's run this huge undertaking, can't sign a contract, and then after the Civil War, she did several things. She wrote a wonderful memoir of the war, My Story of the War, which is available on Amazon. She became an editor for a pioneering feminist journal, the Woman's Journal. And she also wrote an autobiography, The Story of My Life. And I love the story of how the autobiography came about, because her husband told her, I think you've had a remarkable life. I think you should write it up. And oh, no. I don't have the materials it would take, blah, blah, blah. And her husband said, I have saved as much as I could. I have saved the materials. You can write your autobiography. So, shall we say he was a supportive spouse. And then finally, my last woman that I want to highlight, Antoinette Brown Blackwell. And she's another one. She's just an amazing woman. Her date, she was born in 1825. Take a little sip of water. She had educational aspirations, and Oberlin College in Ohio opened its doors to women in 1838. She got there in the 1840s, and she became close friends with another well-known 19th century activist, Lucy Stone. And I've read a lot of the correspondence. So she and Lucy Stone rebelled against the ban on public speaking. In those years, women were being told, had St. Paul quoted to them, "Let your women keep silent in your churches." And Oberlin admitted women, but they didn't want women to give talks in class. And so Antoinette and Lucy rebelled against that. And they write to each other, oh, you know, I have all my reform aspirations. I want to be a lecturer. I want to end slavery. I want to, you know, but will I ever find a husband that will go along with my program? Well, the two women married brothers. Lucy Stone married Henry Blackwell, and Antoinette married Samuel Blackwell. And this was a remarkable family, the Blackwell family, because the sister of those two brothers was Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman doctor. So anyhow, they're feminist abolitionist lectures. And then I should have the date, I don't have it, but Antoinette Brown Blackwell was ordained, the first woman in the country to be ordained by a mainstream congregation, and that was the Congregationalists. And again, as I mentioned, Daniel Livermore was so supportive. Samuel Blackwell, who was a merchant, he operated out of their home so that his wife would be able to hit the lecture trail. And they had 6 children. So somehow or other, I mean, she was a force of nature, obviously. After the Civil War, she wrote for the Woman's Journal, as you know, Mary Livermore edited it for some years. But the thing that drew me to her was I found out that when Darwin published The Descent of, he publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859, I believe. But then in 1872, he publishes The Descent of Man. Well, The Descent of Man is distinctly sexist. He locates the whole, the whole locus of progress among species to male enterprise, to male victory in battle. And women are kind of an afterthought, the bearers. And Antoinette Brown Blackwell did not like that much. And so she wrote a book that is a woman's, a well thought out, I think brilliantly argued response to Darwin. It's called The Sexes Throughout Nature. And that, again, you can get on Amazon. And in it, she argues, how do we know what women are capable of as long as women have all the domestic work? And she really tries to take on a lot of the arguments in The Descent of Man, you know, one after another. Now, the great tragedy is that she was not credentialed the way a man would have been. And so her book never had an impact. She wasn't arguing against evolution. She was arguing against the idea that women were kind of an afterthought. And she said at one point, when women are able to leave the home and the husbands stay home and take care of the babies, that's when we'll know what women are capable of. Well, as I say, it didn't have the impact she might have wished, but it's a wonderful document of the fact that there were people trying to answer the whole idea. Well, when I started researching first my first book and then my second book, but mostly my first book, which is called Just a Housewife, I couldn't believe how negative the view of female nature was that I'm seeing cropping up. And about this time, there are some feminist historians of science who are pointing out, well, instead of having males struggle with the engine of progress, you could have language, women are good at that. You could have nurture, women are good at that. So it's a very selective view of the engine of evolution, and she countered that. In her late years, she corresponded with Carolyn, with a Unitarian, very important Unitarian woman in Los Angeles. They agreed they refused to die until women could vote. I read the correspondence at the Huntington Library. Antoinette, Carolyn Severance died before Antoinette. She died before 1920, but in California, women got to vote in 1911. So she lived to be able to vote. Antoinette Brown Blackwell, born in 1825, lived to vote in 1920. She didn't die until 1921. It gives me goosebumps. And Lucy Stone was a few years older than she, her dear friend, and Lucy Stone predeceased her. Blackwell lived to speak at the 100th anniversary celebration of Lucy Stone's death. So it's, you know, it's a remarkable life. So we have the first woman ordained clergy person. By the way, after she was ordained as a Congregationalist, but she never could find a congregation who wanted to hear her. So she was ordained one way, but then after the Civil War, it was Unitarian pulpits she filled. And so that concludes my remarks. I hope I didn't go on too long, but I do get very carried away when I talk about these women.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Ladies and gentlemen, we have lost internet connection over at the building. So they are trying to get the internet restarted. So in lieu of,
Carol.
yeah, Carol's here. So in lieu of the fact that they're not here, we're gonna keep the show moving, and Carol is going to bring us our closing hymn, number 162, Gonna Lay Down My Sword and Shield. So without further ado, here's Carol.
Thank you, Don.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Gonna study war no more. Gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Gonna shake hands around the world, everywhere I go, everywhere I go, everywhere I go. Gonna shake hands around the world, everywhere I go. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have lit a chalice at home, now is the time to extinguish that chalice. I don't have any chalice extinguishing words prepared. But let's make it so that everybody can do anything. And thank you, Dr. Matthews, for that very enlightening and educational service. I learned about 4 individuals that I really didn't know anything about, and see if I can slip down that rabbit hole. So.